Hi there, everyone. Today is our fifth installment of Real Facts, Real Simple. I'm Deb Lavoy, founder of Reality Team, and this week with me is John Cook. John Cook is a research assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University, and he studies the cognitive psychology of climate science denial. His research focus is understanding and countering misinformation about climate change, but also against other types of science. He's also a very clever cartoonist, and that makes a lot of his lessons and lectures go down real easy. I met John when he was doing some research in preparation for a game that he's about to publish. That's a fun way to learn to detect and debunk these bad arguments against science. I learned a lot, and I found that it was very empowering to be able to identify and put a name against some of these techniques of science denial and be able to say, aha, I know what that is and I know how to debunk it. So I thought he'd be a very interesting person to talk to today. So John, hi, how are you?
Hey, good, thanks. Thanks for that generous intro.
Well, I've been a fan of your work for a while, so I'm really glad that we can, tell more people about it. So just as a place to get started, tell us a little bit about how you came to study the techniques of science denial. I've never seen anyone who had a PhD in techniques of science denial before.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question. I'm not sure how far back I should go, but I guess when I started the PhD, that's not what I was planning to study. We wanted to develop a model for denial, like a cognitive model that simulated denial and help us to understand it better. And what we found developed just going through that research process of trying to understand denial was that when someone who doesn't trust scientists and science encounters scientific information, they can sometimes respond in a backfire kind of way, like actually double down on their beliefs. And so scientific information can sometimes, not always, rarely, but sometimes backfire. And that got me thinking, could you make misinformation backfire? Could you prime people so that when they encounter misinformation, it actually causes them to believe that misinformation even less? And so I started exploring priming, inoculating people, and that took me down the path of learning the techniques of denial and teaching those to other people so that when they see those techniques of denial in misinformation, the misinformation doesn't influence them.
Thank you for that. I'm glad you're actually doing that. Can you, that led you to, you initially focused on climate denial, and you've started to apply that to that same structure that you studied with regard to climate denial. You started applying to other types of science, like, for instance, denying the science around coronavirus. Is that right?
Exactly so. Like for the last decade and a half, I've been focused on climate misinformation. And just through the process of studying all the different arguments in climate misinformation, building up a catalogue of all the different rhetorical techniques and logical fallacies used in climate denial. And then 2020 happened, and this blitz of COVID-19 misinformation. And what really struck me was just how quickly I was seeing all the same fallacies over and over, and just broad and comprehensive, but in fast motion. It was like the last 20 years of climate misinformation crammed into a couple of months of this fire hose of COVID denial. And it got me thinking that all the techniques being applied to neutralize climate misinformation could just as equally be applied to neutralizing COVID misinformation. So I've started analyzing COVID denial, deconstructing them, exposing the fallacies, and then communicating those fallacies through social media.
So as part of this, you've identified a series of techniques, and you've actually sort of outlined them into a taxonomy of bad arguments and the way people create these bad arguments. Can you give us an overview of what of that framework? Because to me, I saw that and I heard angels sing. Da. It's exactly what I needed.
No, that was just me. I was.
Oh, that was you humming. Okay, good.
So
Flick.
Yeah, so Flick. So the 5 techniques of denial were first developed by Mark Hoofnagel. He blogged just listing them, and I've found them really useful. Just this framework. But then I was giving a workshop about climate misinformation in Sydney to I guess teenagers. Like it was the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and I wanted to communicate these 5 techniques of science denial in a sticky, easy to remember way. So I started to think, well, an acronym is a really good way for people to get their hooks into it, to remember it. So I started thinking, well, you've got fake experts, unrealistic expectations, cherry picking. Actually, I'm going in a bad direction here. I better start over. Then I eventually came up with fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories, or FLIC. It's just a very sticky, easy way to remember it. And it's also just a very useful framework for making sense of misinformation. It's not the whole thing. Like logical fallacies is a very broad umbrella, and underneath that there are a whole range of sub-logical fallacies, but it's that overarching set of categories that help you make sense of misinformation.
So I want to kind of dig into a couple of those, a couple of the techniques there. So one thing that we've seen a lot of, especially with regard to coronavirus, is fake experts. So can you tell us a little bit about what a fake expert is, how to spot when you are hearing from a fake expert? And I don't know if you have an example or so in your pocket.
Yeah,
help us.
Well, there was a very good example just over the last 24 hours. At a town hall, Donald Trump said that lots of people are saying that masks are bad, and the host said, "Which people?" And Trump said, "Waiters." So, so he's quoting people as if they had some kind of authority to talk about masks, and it turns out not experts at all. But like there are very obvious examples like that, but the more subtle examples are people who convey the impression of expertise. They might have expertise in a different field, or they may just portray themselves as experts, but they don't have the relevant expertise. And so
we've seen a lot of people in white lab coats.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a month or two ago. We saw these doctors, just general practitioners, all dressed in white coats. They were actually branded, like they all had a logo on their white coats. And the idea here was portray these people as COVID-19 experts, even though none of them did actual epidemiological research. And they were all speaking against, what was the point of it? I think they were mainly promoting hydroxychloroquine, but they also spoke against social distancing or shutting down the economy or even masks, I think, at some point. And I think, like, when you see that, you think, well, how do you tell the difference between someone who's saying that they're an expert or an actual genuine experts? And I think that the obvious red flags is when you see someone who is appealing to their own authority, whether it's wearing a white coat or talking up their expertise, but they're speaking against what the expert community is saying. If there's a scientific consensus on an issue and they're railing against that consensus, that's a red flag that there's a good chance that the person you're looking at might be a fake expert. And that's when you look a little deeper and investigate, do they actually have research expertise in the topic that they're talking about?
Exactly. So how do you evaluate whether someone has research expertise in the area that they're talking about? And probably the other question that comes up is, well, sometimes people have good ideas from other areas. So how do you distinguish between these guys are just fake, they're messing with you, they're manipulating you, versus someone who has legitimate expertise or a legitimate hypothesis?
Yeah. So, well, firstly, getting a degree in one area of science doesn't automatically convey expertise and knowledge in every other area of science. So when there's an example of Peter Navarro on CNN contradicting Anthony Fauci, and when he was questioned, well, what's your expertise? And he said, as an economist, I have a PhD in social science. So having a PhD in a different field does not make you an expert. And I think that we just the general public have to recognize that just because someone has a doctor before their name or a PhD after their name doesn't mean that they're an expert. To tell whether someone is the relevant expert, have they published research papers in that area? Like we're currently doing a study about this very topic with climate change. What makes a climate expert? And the way we ascertain that is we're looking at their published papers and seeing whether those papers are actually relevant to climate change or not. I mean, it's very laborious. Can't expect the average person to get on Google Scholar and start reading a person's publication record. It is a bit of an ask, but that's the general principle. And I guess the first step is look for those red flags. Someone speaking against the scientific consensus while appealing to their own authority.
So why do people bring fake experts into these conversations? Is it strictly to be manipulative?
They do it because it works. Whether it's not necessarily manipulative, and this is actually a really important point to recognize about misinformation and science denial. A lot of people who deny science genuinely believe what they believe, probably most of them, or nearly all. There are a few very black-souled people who deliberately lie for money or for political reasons, but most people genuinely believe. Like we all have to sleep at night. We all have to, we all think of ourselves as heroes in our own story. But when people are motivated to reject science for whatever reason, whether it's political ideology or social identity or religious beliefs, when we're motivated to reject science, then all these fallacies influence us or help us to avoid science. We don't necessarily cherry pick because we're trying to trick people. Confirmation bias is a real psychological phenomenon. We're all biased towards information that confirms our beliefs, and we tend to disbelieve or distrust information that contradicts our beliefs. That's cherry picking. We all do it to some degree. Similarly, with experts, we attribute greater expertise to people who we agree with. And we all do that as well. Like, have you ever heard somebody look at your music collection, or have you ever looked at someone else's music collection and said, wow, you have great taste in music? You're actually saying you have my taste in music. So we all, if we see someone that agrees with us, we think, well, that person knows what they're talking about. And so when it comes to science denial, then if there's somebody who's a fake expert or has the impression of expertise, but they're saying things that we like, we will naturally gravitate towards that person.
Let's talk about some of the other elements of Flick. So the second element, so F stands for fake experts. I know this because I've been studying you. The L actually stands for logical fallacies. And this is where it gets super interesting. Can you talk a little bit about logical fallacies and why they're effective and how not to fall into those traps?
So a logical fallacy is any argument where the starting assumptions or the premises don't lead to the conclusion. It's like saying, I have green eyes, therefore I know quantum mechanics. Having green eyes, the premise, has nothing to do with the conclusion of knowing quantum mechanics. The conclusion does not follow from the premise.
But we expect it to.
What's that?
But we expect it to.
We expect quantum mechanics to follow from having green eyes.
We expect a conclusion to follow from an argument.
Exactly, yeah. So, and this is why arguments can be persuasive. Like someone will just say, blah, 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 therefore, blah, blah, blah. And if you're not sharply monitoring the structure of the argument, which is a pretty difficult thing to do, especially in real time, that can be quite persuasive. So logical fallacies are a very persuasive way to argue, bad conclusions. And if you do it quickly enough or convincingly enough, you can, it's like a magician, you can sort of distract people and get them agreeing with your conclusion, or at least not identifying the fallacy. So the way
so when should the alarm bells go off in our head that we've just heard a logical fallacy?
So there are a couple of ways of doing it. The hard, slow way is to deconstruct arguments. Think about what are the premises in this argument and what is the conclusion, and then do those premises logically lead to the conclusion. So that's often it takes a pen and paper, and it's sort of...
That's the hard way.
It is the slow, hard way. The quick way is to learn the patterns of different fallacies. Learn what a false dichotomy is. A false dichotomy is when someone says it's either this or that. If you see an argument where it's an or proposition, that should be at least, like, it doesn't necessarily follow that it is a false dichotomy, but that should be a red flag. Look a little closer and see, is it only those two options that they're presenting? Or is there a third option? Or might both those options be true at the same time?
So give an example of a false dichotomy.
A false dichotomy would be, okay, you put me on the spot. I'm suddenly having...
Sorry about that.
It's like, all right, I'll go to Star Wars because Star Wars is always my go-to. It's, I think, like Anakin said, you're either with me or you're against me, which I think George Bush might have said the same thing around after 9/11. It's like saying you're either on our side or you're on the terrorist side, or you want to go to war with us or you're not a patriot. Maybe it's patriotic to not want to go to war because you think that peaceful diplomatic solutions are better for the country. There's a third option available there, see? And so with false dichotomies, or when you're presented a dichotomy, see if there are other options. And if there are, then it's a false dichotomy.
It's interesting how when you see a statement that's as simple and clean as you're either with me or against me, it's very easy to say, oh yes, that must be true, therefore I have to make this decision. But it doesn't necessarily have to be true.
No, and the big challenge with misinformation is they often are very simple. They can be because they're not bound by the truth. And misinformation is more viral than accurate information because it's not bound by reality. It can be as simplistic or as emotional or as eye-catching and extreme as they like. It's not bound by reality, whereas communicating accurate information, being bound by being true to reality, it's kind of an unequal playing field, and that's why myths have been shown to be much more viral than facts. That's not a hopeless situation, though. It just means that when we communicate our facts, we need to communicate them in very conscious ways that make the facts just as sticky, as simple and understandable, as compelling and engaging as the myths that we're trying to debunk.
So one thing you might think about is, well, a couple things following up from that statement. The first is that when something is super simple and clear and seems, oh yes, it must be true, that might be one of the flags where you say, maybe I should think about this a little longer.
Well, I mean, as I just said, if you can communicate your facts in sticky ways, in simple, compelling ways, then you are more likely to be effective. So I guess if you see something that is too good to be true or too simple or too shocking, then yeah, definitely give it a second look. But there is a danger though of being too cynical or too skeptical where you just don't believe anything. And that can be destructive too.
We see a lot of that.
When people are presented with facts and myths and they can't tell which is true, then they just disengage and don't believe either. And we can't have that. If people like not believing accurate information is just as damaging as believing inaccurate information.
Can you talk about a few more of the logical fallacies?
Yeah, so like I talked about false dichotomy. The other one that I'm seeing a lot of in 2020 is false equivalence. It just seems to be happening a lot around COVID-19. False equivalence is when two things have been held up to be similar to each other in some way, but aren't. And that can come in several forms. The most common form, I think, being false analogy, where it says that these two things are similar in this way, therefore they must also be similar in this other way. Let me give you an example. In the debate about whether people, this is earlier, like probably a few months back, the debate has kind of evolved over time, but in the early stages, when people were debating about mail-in votes, one of the arguments was, well, people line up for a cupcake in Washington, D.C., or they line up for a burger or something for hours if it's something they really want. So why wouldn't they also want to line up to vote, which is more important than a cupcake? And it's arguing that these things are similar in one way, that people lining up for something important. Therefore, it's similar in another way. Like if they are willing to line up for a cupcake, they should also be willing to line up to vote as well. Now, when you encounter these analogies saying this thing is like this thing, what you need to do is think about what are the differences between the two things being compared, and do those differences, are they big enough to falsify the conclusion? The conclusion in this case is people should line up to vote on election day. But the difference between these two examples is that lining up for a cupcake is a luxury. It's a voluntary luxury for people who have the resources to do it. Lining up to vote is a constitutional right that everyone should have the right to do without having to put their health in danger. And so that difference is enough to make the conclusion false.
That's a very important difference. It's a particularly good example. So we've talked about fake experts. We've talked about false dichotomies. We've talked about false analogies. Mm-hmm. There are a couple more elements of your framework. And after we talk a little bit about this, I would love to hear if anybody who's watching this has some questions that they'd like answered. So F is for fake experts, L is for logical fallacies, and actually on your site you have quite a little subset of logical fallacies. They're all kind of interesting, but I think the two you chose are probably the most important to understand. Impossible expectations. This is one that happens a lot in climate science. Like if you can find one thing that doesn't match the others, the arguer will take that opportunity to say, see, it's all wrong. Can you talk to us a little bit about impossible expectations and how you know that they're impossible?
Yeah, so impossible expectations is basically the argument that we don't know everything, therefore we know nothing. And we see that with climate change when climate models get attacked. They'll say, well, climate models didn't get this prediction perfect, or even they combine impossible expectations with a false analogy when they say scientists can't predict the weather next week, so how are they going to predict climate 30 years from now? Which is A, impossible expectation, but B, it's comparing two things that are quite different. Weather and climate are two different things. So often those combinations of fallacies can be challenging too. We also see impossible expectations in COVID-19 in attacks on the model predictions on future cases and future deaths from COVID-19, and the fact that these models are constantly changing their predictions. They're changing them as they bring in new data and as people change their behavior. The models depend on human behavior. And so it's an impossible expectation to say that these models should know exactly what's going to happen in the future when new data is constantly being provided and society is moving in different directions. So yeah, it's basically demanding standards from the science that are impossible for the science to produce. And really the end goal is to cast doubt on science and erode public trust in scientific research.
So fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking is what the first C in Flick stands for. Talk a little bit about cherry picking.
So cherry picking is when you have a full body of evidence that's, when you look at all the evidence, it's pointing in this direction, and you just cherry pick, you just select carefully a little bit of evidence that points in a different direction. And so an example in climate change is looking at the temperature record. Temperature jumps up and down from year to year because of internal variability. The ocean is exchanging heat with the atmosphere. You have ocean cycles like El Nino. It's very noisy. So you have this up and down from year to year, but it's up and down, but moving upwards as global warming is gradually moving temperature upwards. But because it's moving up and down, you can cherry pick short periods where it looks like the temperature is flat. It's not happening at all. And so that technique is used to argue, hey, look, from 1998 to 2004, the trend looks flat, therefore global warming isn't happening. We saw a lot of these global warming has stopped arguments by cherry picking short periods. That argument is less tenable because the temperature continues to rise, and it accelerated in 2014, 2015, and 2016. It became so warm that it became pretty much impossible to deny that the temperature was going up. No, sorry, that's not true. It didn't become impossible because in 2017, when the US pulled out of the climate accords, Scott Pruitt argued that we'd been in a hiatus since the late 1990s. So even still, they continue to cherry pick and argue against the full body of evidence.
So a lot of that has to do with sort of, that's the lies, damn lies, and statistics kind of argument that you can, if you're clever enough, you can make data say whatever you want it to in some ways. Is that similar?
Yeah, cherry picking is probably the hardest one to spot because it requires knowledge. In order to know whether the evidence being cited conflicts with the full body of evidence, you kind of need to know what the full body of evidence says. So it does take a bit of work to cherry pick, to find those right statistics that tell the story you want. But they are difficult for the layperson to spot.
So I'm going to ask my questions a little bit out of order here. So I see something. It contradicts other stuff I've heard. It contradicts perhaps the prevailing consensus. What should I do when I see something that just smells fishy?
Well, I think that generally what you need to do is first see, is there an expert consensus on the question that you're looking at? Have scientists, have the scientific community at large already come to agreement on this issue? And if the
So
experts
Google
agree,
it.
then that's definitely like a sign that there is overwhelming evidence for that, for whatever the question that you're looking at. So that's definitely the first port of call. Sorry, you had a question?
So that's a Google search. And so, you know, your first step is to Google and see what people are saying.
Googling can get you to the right information, but make sure that when you do go through the search results, you look at authoritative sources. Don't go to a random anonymous website. Go to institutional websites such as the National Academy of Science or NASA or NOAA or the CDC or the World Health Organization. These institutions vet the information that they publish. And so it's a much higher quality of information. Doesn't mean that everything there is foolproof, but when you have experts vetting information, it's basically a spam filter on steroids. So it tends to be the most reliable type of information you can find.
So what if a scientist has a legit theory that might be, that might challenge the status quo or the consensus? What's the difference, and how can you tell the difference between someone who is just distorting the information either because they don't understand it properly or because they have some sort of malicious intent, and a legitimate scientist or expert who is testing out or trying out a different theory? Can you tell the difference there?
There's two things to look for. Firstly, what is the nature of the scientific consensus they're disagreeing with, and how do they disagree with the scientists? So let me discuss both of those. When you have a scientific consensus on any question, they're not always right. There have been scientific consensuses that have been overturned in the past, but generally a scientific consensus is more likely to be what philosophers call knowledge-based or true, if it has the following three traits. It's based on a consilience of evidence, as in there's multiple lines of evidence all independently pointing to this one conclusion. There is a diversity of amongst the scientific community. So it's not just all one group of people, you know, from one country, for example, all agreeing. It's global in nature, or it's people from different countries, and ideally across different disciplines. Like you have had examples where you've had like just the European scientific community disagreeing with the American scientific community over something like plate tectonics or something. And so it was less of a diverse community in both cases. But when you achieve this global, diverse social consensus, that is a lot stronger, more robust than isolated, I guess, more homogenous groups. And thirdly, when they're all speaking from within the same common frame of reference. And for example, they're all basing their scientific consensus on empirical evidence. And so a good example of a knowledge-based consensus or a robust consensus is climate change. You have a global scientific consensus across the world, across all these different disciplines, all collecting evidence in different ways that are all pointing to the same conclusion, that humans are causing global warming. there's robust evidence and a diverse scientific community. So that's the scientific consensus aspect. As for the lone voice who is disagreeing with the consensus, the thing to look for there is Flick, basically. Are they employing the techniques of science denial in their arguments against the scientific consensus? So if you see denialist techniques, if you see Flick in their arguments, and they're employing these techniques of denial against a robust knowledge-based scientific consensus, you can be confident that this isn't a new modern-day Galileo who's going to overturn the consensus. It's more likely to be a cranky uncle who's just in denial about the science.
We all have one of those cranky uncles. And for those of you who don't know, that's sort of John's alter ego is cranky uncle.
Well, alter ego implies that it's me, right? Like, so some people have started calling me the cranky uncle, which was never my intent. So I'm a bit dismayed at that development.
Your cartoons leverage the cranky uncle as a way to get some of this information across. I want to get to the last C because I think it's very, 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 very important in 2020, and a lot of people have a hard time with it. So when people make these bad arguments, these false arguments, when they deny science, it's very discomforting. And as you say, it tends to make you just step back. I don't know what's true anymore. I just don't want to deal with it. They can be, these false dichotomies, these fake experts, these false analogies, they trick you very easily. The last one, the last C, which stands for conspiracy theories, is sort of a pox upon the world right now. Conspiracy theories seem to have gone from something that was a very fringe element of society that has exploded into the mainstream. Can you talk to us about how to identify conspiracy theory and how to deconstruct that a little bit?
Yeah, so the acronym FLICK summarizes the 5 techniques of science denial. We also developed an acronym for the different traits of conspiratorial thinking. And I actually spent like about 3 hours on a plane flight from Australia to the US trying to come up with the acronym, juggling the words around. And I was trying to get tinfoil as the acronym, but I couldn't crack the L. So in the end, what we used as a way of remembering the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking is the acronym CONSPIRE. Conspiracy theories are, or the traits of conspiratorial thinking are contradictory. They don't have a commitment to coherence. They often contradict themselves. They involve overriding suspicion. So they don't believe any data, like even government data, even data from the CDC or the World Health Organization or NASA. It involves nefarious intent. They believe that whoever these conspirators are, they have an evil plot to deceive us about climate change, take away our freedom, implant chips inside our bodies. There's always some evil plot involved in these conspiracies. The only time a conspiracy wouldn't involve an evil plot is maybe a surprise birthday party or something. S stands for something must be wrong. The one kind of foundational belief that conspiracy theorists have is the official account must be wrong. So that's why they're contradictory. That's why they have overriding suspicion, because whatever the government's telling you, whatever the institution or the scientists are telling you must be wrong. And that has a lot of consequences, which I'll come to. P stands for persecuted victimhood. Conspiracy theorists see themselves as being victims persecuted by the conspirators, but at the same time they also see themselves as heroes fighting against the conspiracy. I stands for immune to evidence. Whenever you present information to a conspiracy theorist that contradicts their conspiracy theory or shows that it's false, they expand their conspiracy theory to include wherever that information came from. So an example with climate change was there was a conspiracy theory about scientists faking the data. And when universities and governments investigated the scientists and concluded there was no evidence of wrongdoing, the conspiracy theorists expanded their conspiracy to include the investigators who must have been in on the conspiracy as well. And the last one is reinterpreting randomness, joining the dots between random events. Wuhan has a biolab. COVID-19 started in Wuhan. Therefore, the lab must have engineered the COVID-19 virus. Or COVID started in 2019. 5G was introduced in 2019. That can't be a coincidence. Therefore, 5G must cause COVID-19. Takes these random things that have no connection and joins the dots between them. And that's one of the big telltale red flags of conspiratorial thinking, is reinterpreting randomness as being meaningful.
There's a word for that. It begins with a P.
Pattern detection.
Pattern detection, we'll go with that.
Or patternicity, I think, is another way of saying it.
So conspiracy theories have a huge presence in the media today. Something I thought we could ignore for a long time is of course QAnon. And I don't know to what extent you've ever looked at those, what's coming out of there, and if that's really not just one conspiracy theory, but sort of, the unified theory of all conspiracy theories ever created. Is that an area that you've spent time looking at or studying?
I haven't done specific research on QAnon, just kind of monitor it from a distance kind of thing. But I have been I viewed QAnon the way a lot of people did, thinking it was quite extreme and outlandish. But what has really dismayed me over the last few months is seeing the QAnon movement forming alliances with other conspiracy theory communities, such as anti-vaxxers in particular. And so they're kind of combining their efforts and amplifying each other's theories, and just using those networks to just push their conspiracy theories out to a much broader audience. And so that has really helped conspiratorial thinking just propagate in a much more dangerous way than I think we've seen before.
So if we talk about Flick as a whole, fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories, it's a lot to keep in your mind. It's a lot of patterns to try to learn. And you realized that a long time ago, and you started working on a game to help people learn these patterns. Do you want to talk a little bit about the game and how you made it and where it's going?
Yeah, so a lot of the thinking in putting this game together is I've been thinking about Daniel Kahneman's book, Slow and Fast Thinking. Earlier, I was talking about how deconstructing an argument is that slow, hard way of doing things. Kahneman talks about how we have two types of thinking. Slow thinking, which is just rationally working through problems, difficult, effortful thinking. And that it's effortful, it's hard, and it's something that we don't do that much because it's hard. The other type of thinking is fast thinking, where we just instantly react, whether it's an emotional reaction or we have mental shortcuts or heuristics where we just make snap judgments. But almost all of our thinking is fast thinking, and trying to make people do more slow thinking, which we should be doing. That's what education is about. That's what teaching critical thinking is about. But it's a psychological reality that the vast bulk of our thinking is fast thinking, and that's just how we're hardwired. But Kahneman also talks about a third type of thinking, which he calls expert heuristics. An example is a doctor, like a surgeon. He or she has done so many operations that she can go into a situation and assess it instantly, just through that experience and practice, years of doing this.
She sees the patterns.
Yeah, practice. And so what Kahneman is arguing is that things that would normally be a slow thinking process, like assessing a complicated situation, can become a fast thinking process through practice. It becomes instant and effortless after enough practice has been done. And that's really the guiding principle of this Cranky Uncle smartphone game. The idea that critical thinking is hard, it's slow thinking, but if we practice critical thinking, we can convert that slow thinking process into a fast thinking instant response. And so the way I do that is I get people practicing spotting the different fallacies in misinformation. And we use humor and cartoons as a way to keep them entertained and playing the game longer and longer. The more they play the game, the more practice they do, the better they get at spotting those red flags in misinformation.
Yeah, so the first thing I ever saw of yours was one of your sort of test quizzes for that. And it was addictive. It was super interesting. I learned a lot just going through it one time, and came away with things that I remembered and then could spot almost immediately. And then, and so that's why I was so excited about your work, because once you can name something, once you can say, aha, I know what that is, it gives you the confidence to sort of debunk it. It gives you the confidence that you can go out into the information world and say, aha, I can tell truth from fiction, or at least I can tell when I should be skeptical. And I think that's an incredibly empowering opportunity, because I study this stuff all the time. I've been studying it for years and I still get fooled. Everybody gets fooled. And so being able to just sort of say, aha, that's cherry picking, that's a false dichotomy, it's just very comforting. It's very empowering. And the games and the cartoons, they're clever, they're funny, they're silly, and yet they're effective. So your website is Cranky Uncles.
crankyuncle.com, singular.
Oops, sorry.
I think crankyuncles.com will still end you up at crankyuncle.com anyway.
So I just put it into the comments here so that people can take a look at that. And on that website, you see a really interesting mix of a few things. You see some sort of academic stuff and videos that are sort of geared toward your students. But then you also see really interesting videos that sort of take one bit of weird misinformation that's going on around and debunk it. You did a series on the infamous movie Plandemic that was really interesting. And you do have a bunch of cartoons and fun blog posts and that sort of thing. So depending on where you are in whether you're a little bit nerdy or you're looking for some entertaining way to get a better grip on what's going on in the misinformation world, there's something for everyone here. When do you think the game is going to get published?
I could probably answer that better in about 40 minutes. I'm actually meeting with the game developers just after this meeting. So Roughly 1 month. Like, we've actually just finished the game last week developing it, and now we're beta testing it. And our rough plan is, it's kind of like, maybe I'm just thinking 2020 pandemic, but we're going through 3 phases. Phase 1 was just us testing ourselves. Phase 2, we'll just get a small group of people testing it. And then phase 3, we'll get a large group of people testing the game, and then we'll launch. I'll take a leaf out of the president's book and say we're gonna have the game out before November 3.
Okay, sooner is better. So if people are interested in learning more about this game or signing up and getting either into your bigger beta, if you have one of those, or get the game, they can go to your website and type in their email address, subscribe to your email list, and they'll get notified about that.
Yeah. So if you subscribe on crankyuncle.com, you get an instant email notification whenever anything cool happens. Roughly send an email out once a week.
Excellent. So, just to sort of sum up here a little bit, I think that the key things that you're talking about are, there is a set pattern. There are common patterns. There are common techniques that people use to deny science, all different kinds of science, and sometimes other types of reality as well. And you can name them. You can practice so that you can identify them quickly. And that is going to protect you from getting fooled and feeling bullied by these fake arguments.
If I could say one thing about that, there's really three benefits of inoculation, of learning the techniques of denial. Firstly, you protect yourself from being misled, so you build up your own resilience so you don't get tricked. Secondly, by not being tricked, you're not going to then share that misinformation and infect others. You don't want to be a super spreader of misinformation. And thirdly, inoculation empowers people to talk about difficult issues. There's research into this phenomenon called post-inoculation talk. They find that when people learn the counter arguments that they're likely to encounter, like cherry picking or logical fallacies, they feel more confident to be able to talk about that issue, because if they encounter pushback, they know how to respond to it.
They know how to respond. That really is, that's key. All right, well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I want to thank you very much for your time. I'm really looking forward to the game. One of the things that you do have still up on your site are the sort of pre-test quizzes that you use to develop the game. I'll share those with the audience as well, because they even without the cartoons, even without the humor, they're super interesting and fun to work with, and very, very effective at teaching you a few of these tricks. So I'll put that out there too. I appreciate the chat today, and I'll be following closely and pestering you about when I can get that game.
I'll be happy to share it with you once I can't wait to have it out so that I can share it with everyone.
All right. Thanks, John. I appreciate your being here today.
Thanks a lot, Deb.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Conversations About a Way Forward from Count Me In to Win and The Talk on Main Street. To learn more, find us on Facebook at The Talk on Main Street.